Hi, welcome to this presentation about the Every Student Succeeds Act, the ESSA, and assessment for English learners. Sometimes in the world of ESOL, I find myself feeling a little bit like this. We certainly like our acronyms, don't we? But I'm giving you one more today, the ESSA, which is an important piece of education policy legislation that impacts English learners in some pretty important ways. So to give a little bit of context for what we're going to discuss today, I think it benefits us to think of ourselves as advocates in this kind of situation. We spend a lot of time learning about specific instructional strategies, which is wonderful and helpful. Today we're kind of putting on a different hat. We're looking at policy and we're thinking about ourselves more in the policy realm as ESOL educators. So let's get started with a little bit of historical context. The first predecessor of the ESSA was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was passed in 1965 by President Lyndon Johnson, and this was really the first piece of education legislation that we had in the United States that wanted to create a sense of accountability. Schools would be accountable for achievement, and their federal funding would be tied to their ability to prove that achievement. This was kind of the first time that step was taken, and also the first time that legislation explicitly committed to helping student populations who had traditionally been pretty underserved in our system. Much later, in 2001, the United States passed No Child Left Behind. This was necessary because the Elementary and Secondary Education Act had expired and it needed to be reauthorized. So No Child Left Behind effectively did this, and it also made some changes in how funding would be dispersed. It was a much stricter paradigm for dishing out funding, and schools were accountable for achieving specific achievement on standardized testing in order to receive that funding. And then in 2015, we again needed to reauthorize the ESEA, and that is where we got the Every Student Succeeds Act. This act essentially replaced No Child Left Behind, and there were some pretty key things that changed, specifically in regards to how English learners are serviced in our schools with the passing of the ESSA. So we are going to talk about 4 impacts of this most recent legislation on ESOL instruction in schools today. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to look at how this was approached under No Child Left Behind, and then what, if anything, has changed under the Every Student Succeeds Act. So the first category of impact that we're going to look at is classifying English learners. So under the No Child Left Behind Act, this is something that individual districts would decide for themselves. And so this resulted in pretty huge differences even just within a state, because, for example, the Beaverton School District would decide for themselves how they wanted to classify English learners, and maybe Salem-Keizer had a completely different system, but it was at the district level that was decided. Under ESSA, the federal government now requires the state departments of education to design a system for identifying, serving, and reclassifying English learners that will apply to all districts within the state. So, this move has some benefits and some drawbacks, and it presents some challenges for districts. One of the potential benefits is that it makes classifying English learners more uniform across the state, which is beneficial particularly with more transient student populations. when moving from one district to another, instead of having to completely reinvent the wheel with their English learner status, it will basically be a uniform process across the state, which should ease that process a little bit. There are some potential drawbacks to this kind of system as well. In our presentation, we discussed how districts vary from district to district. The needs of districts, the number of English learners, the needs of English learners can vary quite a bit. And in the past, districts had the ability to decide how they individually could best serve English learners. But now that won't be the case. They will be expected to implement whatever system the state comes up with. And anytime you have this kind of top-down rollout of policy, it is a challenge for districts. They have to invest in the funding and the time and the resources to get everybody up to speed on what's expected. So it could be a challenge, but there are some potential benefits as well. Okay, the next area of impact for English learners under the ESSA is regarding standardized testing. Under No Child Left Behind, every single student had to be tested at regular intervals, usually yearly, at least once yearly. And so this did increase accountability for schools because it held them responsible for the success of all students in the school. But under the ESSA, they're doing things a little differently, and the intention is more to show growth than just a flat achievement number. So schools won't be accountable in ways that could impact funding or require remediation for newly arrived immigrant pass rates on standardized tests. But they do need to demonstrate these students' growth over time, and by these newly immigrant students, they will be assessed on the same level as their peers in their third year. So this is generally considered to be a pretty good thing for English learners. What is the advantage of a growth model for assessing English learners? In general, it's a more positive and productive way to look at the health of a school's success with English learners, because the expectation is not one of punishment if a flat level of achievement isn't yet reached. It's more an incentive to invest in each student's growth, starting from wherever they began. So generally, this is considered to be a really positive thing for English learners. And the next category of impact is English proficiency. And how the legislation handles this is in terms of titles, which are sections of law that fund different programs. So under No Child Left Behind, English learners used to just have a Title III designation, which Title III is specific to English learners, and it is a pot of funding that guarantees and provides some services to them in schools. Under the Every Student Succeeds Act, English learners will also be considered under Title I, which some of you from your experience working in Title I schools will know. That's a much more broad category. It refers to students who have social and economic disadvantages and provide services such as free and reduced lunch, and also additional reading and literacy support. So adding English learners to a Title I designation is generally considered to be very positive because it will put them in a higher profile category and also potentially allow them to be beneficiaries of a much bigger pot of funding. So generally that is considered to be a positive thing. Okay. The fourth category of impact that we will consider is reporting. So under No Child Left Behind, there were really broad requirements for reporting the success of various groups. So essentially for English learners, there was just one group, English learners, and that would include everyone from someone who just arrived in our country yesterday to someone who has been in ESOL services for 5 years. So it wasn't very specific or meaningful data to collect. The Every Student Succeeds Act requires much more specific data collection about the success of English learners. Specifically, it breaks them down into subgroups such as reclassified English proficient learners, so those who have who are no longer taking part in specific English instruction or services. We're still collecting some data on them. Also, English learners with disabilities, English learners receiving services for more than 5 years, and a couple other ones. So this is all about collecting much more specific data. And this has been met with some optimism and also some skepticism. So one of the questions that we have is what does collecting this kind of specific data reveal about a school? And so in some cases it gives us good information that's very encouraging. But in other cases, and those who are advocates for English learners would consider this a good thing, it almost results in what they've called a name and shame kind of situation, in which, for example, a school who has the majority of their English learners who are at an advanced level but have been receiving services for many years without being reclassified, if you just collect data on their English learners, it looks like they're doing an amazing job. But once you break it down into the subgroups and you see where the growth and achievement is really happening and what groups are not receiving adequate services, that's where you get that name and shame idea, that they're accountable for every student and not just anyone who falls under a broad umbrella of students. So generally people feel that this provision will hold schools more accountable in positive ways for the diversity of English learners that we have in our system. There are also potentially some negative outcomes of the pressure of reporting. One, which has been seen in several states, involves the pressure to achieve high English proficiency, resulting in very strict English-only instruction programs. So, in states like Arizona and California, the idea has been to get them English proficient as fast as possible and to put all the resources into that, at the expense of other types of approaches such as bilingual education, which supports L1 but maybe has a slower trajectory for English language development. So that is a little bit controversial. There's some concern that the pressure of reporting is maybe driving too much of what kind of programs we choose to implement. So in general, the Every Student Succeeds Act does do quite a bit to move things forward for English learners, although there are still questions about how to best do this. And one thing that is pretty specific in this piece of legislation is that it will mostly be up to states to decide the specifics. So likely there will be quite a bit of variation in between states on how this will all pan out. But in the meantime, we as teachers have a responsibility to understand the details of this legislation so we can best serve our students and be good advocates for the systems that will work best for them. So thank you. And thank you to Tatiana Ceballos and Robin Ashford for their help in researching this presentation.